When I first began teaching ESL in South Korea, I was encouraged by my administrators and colleagues to create a classroom environment in which the students were always talking. Therefore, very few reading activities were incorporated into my lessons. I even expressed my inexperience and discomfort with teaching reading lessons in one of my first online discussions in this program. As a result, the majority of the tasks that I adopted in my early years as an educator were heavily focused on conversation. Several examples are shown here, including Connect 4 games, board games, concentration, PPT guessing games, hot potato, and Go-Fish with the instructions provided in the student's L1 and the target sentence structure framed on the whiteboard. Even writing tasks were highly structured and allowed little room for originality or for the students to express their personal thoughts and opinions. The corrections that I provided on these assessments did not support the students' improvement in this area either, being as the majority of it was focused on correcting grammatical, punctuation, and penmanship errors with oversimplified written feedback, like good job and excellent. This did not supply the students with any information that would be useful for them to improve in the future, such as pointing them towards their mistakes and then providing them with guidance on ways of correcting them. However, my first aha moment that revealed to me the flaws in my past pedagogical practices came as I was completing a Funds of Knowledge project for another course. As I was interviewing one of my third grade students and her family in their home, I couldn't help but notice the vast number of books scattered about and on the multiple bookcases in each room. When I asked my students which were hers, she pointed me towards several sets of books which were organized into series. They were not based on the typical topics that I assume third graders read, such as school, hobbies, or friends. Rather, they were educational readers that taught about Greek mythology, history, and science using colorful and humorous illustrations that appealed to children. This also informed me that this was not only an interest of hers, but also the majority of the other students at the school as well. As a matter of fact, the majority of their private discussions revolved around the most recent book that each student was reading. While in the past I believed that my students would be more interested in engaging in activities which were active and allowed them to converse amongst their friends than ones situated around reading. From this interview, though, I learned that my learners not only possessed an intense love for literature, but it was an untapped resource that could be utilized to draw connections between content learning and both their personal interests and prior knowledge. From here, I was shown writing examples that she had composed at her school in her L1. Unlike the writing activities that I typically integrated into lessons, her Korean teachers allowed for more freedom of thought and expression, including writing about their personal lives, writing letters to the characters and stories, and being provided with only an illustration of the beginning of a story, and then developing an ending based on that information. These strategies allowed her to express herself with more creativity, thoughtfulness, and even revealed inner feelings of pain related to her weight and recent fight with a friend. One of the first instances that I had to create an entire lesson around literacy, as well as experience some of the newfound techniques that I learned through my interviews with my student and the weekly textbook readings, was with a freshman high school class that I used as part of my observation requirements. Because I knew that older students also enjoyed books based on Greek mythology and history, I chose a short passage about Medusa and Arachne. Because the students in this class possessed a lower level of English proficiency than others, strategies proposed by Fitzgerald and Graves on page 127, such as graphic organizers and phrasal framing, was displayed on the television throughout the instruction and discussion phases of the lesson as support. These strategies aided them in better comprehending this more difficult piece of text. Lastly, so as to challenge the class to question the main idea in the passage, beyond simply a surface level of understanding, a QAR guide was used as part of the summative assessment with questions that encouraged them to reflect on the reading and relate what they learned back to their own culture and experiences with modesty and vanity. Still, though, upon reflection, I believe that this piece of text was slightly above their ZPD, as it required a large amount of assistance from me throughout the process. While instructing a group of third graders on a unit related to environmental conservation, I wanted to do a better job of selecting a piece of literature that aligned with their current abilities. As a result, this was the first experience that I had with testing the readability of passages beforehand. To do this, I performed both a Fry's readability and closed passage assessment. While the former yielded a 7th grade readability level, the latter produced one which was congruent with my students' level of comprehension. I attributed this discrepancy to the fact that many of them had had previous vocabulary instruction in many of the less frequent used English terms compared to their counterparts in the United States. Similarly, this was also the first time that I applied an anticipation guide to both stimulate the students' thinking on the topic we were prepared to study and to provide me with a formative assessment of their prior knowledge as it relates to the subject. This has now become a strategy that I have adopted as part of my regular classroom practices. Following the reading, 2 summative performance assessments were used to gauge the comprehension of the story. First, following the recommendation of Alverman et al., as well as what I had learned from the writing activities that my Funds of Knowledge subjects teacher utilized, I had the class write a letter to humans from the perspective of an animal of their choice, expressing their feelings of the environment and the humans' treatment of it. The compositions that resulted were far more creative and informative than anything that I have ever received simply from a worksheet. Finally, the class was provided with a box full of used recycled items and instructed to develop a new item. The only stipulation was that the product that they created had to serve a purpose so as to promote the advantages of recycling. This hands-on experience provided a link between the information gained from the reading and the purposes it served in their own lives. The most rewarding experience that I had throughout the program, though, was while working one-on-one with a 3rd grade beginning reader who labored phonemic reading was hindering his fluency and comprehension. As with the previous class, I experimented with various pre-assessment strategies in order to gauge both his current reading level and to find a book that matched that ability. After testing several predictable readers, Hop on Pop by Dr. Seuss was discovered to be the most appropriate. Over the course of 2 months, we engaged in early morning tutoring sessions, employing such strategies as making and breaking words and the creation of a word family dictionary that encouraged him to find patterns in words, group letters together, recognize them on sight, and thus improve the speed and fluency of his reading. Running records were kept throughout this entire process to keep track of his progress in these areas, as well as to supply me with some indication of the areas in need of improvement that we would need to focus on in subsequent meetings. My second aha moment did not come until about 3 months ago, though. This was while I was researching and preparing for both the GACE and EDTPA assessments. From the former, I learned that I wasn't communicating effectively with my learners both prior to and following assessments. Before beginning many assignments, I often failed to thoroughly explain my expectations for the exercises. This would reflect in the work that the students would produce, to which I would further compound with their misunderstanding and confusion by supplying insufficient feedback, such as the examples provided earlier of just good job and excellent. Likewise, I didn't often enough make it a point to include sufficient amounts of differentiation in instruction and metacognitive strategies during lesson planning. As a result, I wanted to make these issues the focus of the final evaluated and observed lessons that I would develop in this program. For the first, I led a group of 3rd graders through a unit on animals and their habitats. The central focus was to eventually complete a project-based learning project suggested by Diaz-Rico on page 174 by writing a short research paper using resources provided in the school's library and give a speech on their findings to the class. Because English proficiency levels of the students varied greatly, leveled readers from the National Geographic Kids series were used in order to differentiate the materials. A rubric was supplied prior to the start of the research project so that each student had a detailed understanding of the points on which I would be grading them. While completing the research project, metalinguistic feedback was also provided as posited by Lightbound and Spada on page 127. What I found was that a greater number of students met the requirements of the assignment compared to past assessments as a result. Finally, I used the teaching of King Midas and the Golden Touch to a 5th grade class as an opportunity to begin instructing on metacognitive strategies, particularly making inferences, predicting, skimming, scanning, and assessing comprehension. For this passage, students scanned for characters' names and write their information prior to reading. Then, following the reading of the first half of the story, answered a series of open and closed comprehension questions, drew inferences about the plot based on the information provided up to this point, and developed 3 possible predictions for how they believed the story would end. Luckily, the strategies employed for teaching this narrative were much more successful than those utilized for the next. As a pre-reading activity for studying the Tea Party scene from Alice in Wonderland, the following week with the same group of 5th grade students, I attempted a Think, Pair, Share exercise for the first time. My intention was for the students to each write detailed descriptions of the personality traits of each of the characters, compare notes with their partners, and then share the most pertinent information that they had collected with the rest of the class. Instead, most just wrote down external characteristics such as hair color and the types of clothes they were wearing. This would have been acceptable if I wasn't already aware of the fact that each of the students possessed extensive prior knowledge of the story, having studied it in their L1 for another course last year. Likewise, the choice of a directed reading activity as a during reading strategy proved to be ineffective. This strategy was chosen in an effort to support the students as they navigated the complex figurative and imaginative language contained in the text. To do so, the passage was divided into 6 smaller sections. After students read each section silently and answered 1 or 2 questions, the class would have a short discussion in order to assess comprehension before moving on to the next part. For the first 2 or 3 sections, the majority of the students were highly engaged and shared their perspectives on the plot. However, after pausing 3 or 4 times to carry out this procedure, many became distracted and lost interest. If I would employ either of these strategies again in the future, I would definitely have to rethink my execution of them. For the most part, I was very pleased with this program. It was highly intense, but the experiences that I gained from it were well worth it. I especially like how I was able to gain practical experience and make connections each week from what we were studying in the modules and events into my classroom. While I was doing the required course readings each week, it was easy to link a strategy or method that I was studying with a student of mine or an experience that I had in the field. Likewise, I began using the weekly discussion postings as almost a journal for which to reflect on and receive feedback from others about successes or failures that I'd experienced. The only suggestion that I would have is that, while I don't completely agree with the assessment, if Georgia is going to make EDTPA such a high-stakes and crucial part of the certification process, teacher training programs should begin aligning the contents of the courses more with what is assessed on EDTPA. There were several instances that I encountered where the terminology that I was taught through coursework differed from that on EdTPA, even when referencing the same topic. And from what I understand, the assessors are very rigid on the terms and phrases that they will accept. Other than that, though, I was very happy. As for the future action research that I'm planning on performing, the most immediate will be related to the topic of my literature review, which was instruction in morphology. Starting next week, I plan on implementing several strategies in my classroom centered around this topic. After a period of time, I would like to develop a research plan that will help me gauge the effectiveness of and any positive or negative results that have had on the literacy learning of my students. Finally, as was evident from this presentation, one thing that I learned early on in this program was how much I have to learn about education. Therefore, my future plans to grow involve constantly learning and researching. Several ways that I plan on doing this are by attending more conferences and possibly presenting at some, as well as constantly collaborating with others in the field. While attending the annual COTESL conference in Korea last year, I was exposed to an abundance of theories and methods that related directly to situations that I encounter in the classroom on a daily basis, such as the overexposure that my students experience to many of the least frequently used words in English, which, in turn, provides them with an advantage when reading highly complex text, but negatively impacts them when they simply want to converse with a native speaker in the more casual registers. This is just one example, but it provided me with proof that one can never stop learning and attempting to improve upon their pedagogical skills in the constantly evolving field of education. I hope you enjoyed my final mini conference presentation and the journey that I've had. Thank you.